thing we were talking about in regards to the notion of death and how strange it would be if you hold a theistic evolutionary position that death was the mechanism that God was using to bring us up to some point where we understand, and one of our great concerns before we made this film, and one of the reasons we made this film, is that we began to see that even our seminaries and some of our prominent pastors were beginning to accept that current paradigm as absolutely true. And therefore, as a reason, they began to lose the notion of an Adam and Eve. And an Adam and Eve now are no longer an individual person or persons, but they are a hominid group. Hominid group that has evolved up to a certain point.
Biologos is starting to pronounce this. Different people, than not all would, but I mean, you have a lot of pastors that are influenced by this, thinking that the science requires it. And that's always that question, what is science? You know, who is this authoritative science that you really, as I think David Berlinski points out, so I've never known science to answer to anything. There's no name. No one answers when I call the name science out. This is all these people that are saying, well, science is science, it's what everyone thinks. Well, everyone doesn't think the same thing. They think all sorts of things. So there's this weird sense of non-scientists who are influenced by imperial science. Oh, I feel it's a little bit like the Wizard of Oz. You know, he's kind of this scary guy that says you must believe this. And then when you get behind him, you start looking in, you're like, I think there's a man controlling this, and I think he's pretty fallible.
So the issue here, though, is the presence of death that has existed for millions and millions of years before we arrive at this hominid group that God somehow, in the mythology of Genesis, has declared to be Adam and Eve, which we realize then brings great problematic things associated with Paul in Romans chapter 5, where he's making the case for Christ as the second Adam. And in the context, he's speaking of Christ as the second Adam because there was a first Adam through whom one man came sin, and then death came through that one man, so life comes through Christ. But the situation we're faced with then in that paradigm is that we have a God, even in their mythological perspective of Genesis, who is coming to Adam and Eve with a consequence of death if they disobey God, which would almost seem to be meaningless to either Adam and Eve or the hominin group. For God say, if you rebel against me, then there will be death, when they look around and they say, there has been nothing but death for millions of years. And I think, as you said one time, they may have even eaten
that was the thing.
The tribe next door.
It's a curious thing. So the old saying is that, and even guys like C.S. Lewis fell into this category, saying that, well, maybe God came to some of this hominin group and he put a soul in two of them. Well, then, could they eat their parents? That sounds kind of terrible, but their parents weren't humans, so there would be no sin there. Couldn't they have, before that, could Adam have slept with who he wanted to? There's all kinds of weird moral issues that get into when you start pushing the line on a view that a biologos has, or I would even say, some of the views of a progressive creationist. When you start pushing it to its logical conclusions, it falls apart in front of the text of the history of what really happened. And I think that's why the origins debate needs to be moved away, in a sense, from some of the science, not important, but you've got to talk about the history and the events and why are those important. And if you're a pastor and you just said, well, I really don't believe Genesis was history, well, then you better have something for history. And so that means you've got to adopt all of these views of death. You've got to adopt views of billions of years. You have to adopt it, because unless you're going to go out and create some third structure, which really hasn't been done yet in terms of timing and all these things, then you're basically forced into one of these two camps.